Happy Wisdom Wednesday, everyone. So, interesting book and a very controversial topic I decided to pick for today, which was Theranos and really the psychology behind it. So, the book is called Mental Traps, and it goes through a variety of cognitive biases and mental traps that we end up falling into that cause us to make the wrong decisions. And I figured, what a great time to mine Loom and essentially weave together different pieces of knowledge in books to explain how something like Theranos happened and how it's probably going to happen again. Now, first on the book, so the book is divided up in a variety of different chapters. I think there's about 8 or 9 mental traps we fall into. And the one that I'm going to focus on for today, which is Theranos, is the idea of persistence, otherwise known as a sunk loss fallacy. Great example of this is if I go to a movie and I buy a ticket. I go and sit down in the movie and 30 minutes pass and it's a terrible movie and I still, let's say, have 2 hours left because it's a long movie. I decide not to leave because I already bought the ticket and I stay longer, right? This is a sunk loss fallacy. There's also a sunk loss fallacy that exists as to why people don't like to read books, or at least don't read more books, because they buy a book, they start reading it, and then halfway through, or not even halfway through, a few pages in, they realize that the book's really not that good, but they keep reading it, right? And part of this is because of the fallacy we fall into called social proof, right? Social proof tells us that what everyone does that's good is persistence. You should stay at something and persevere. But there's a difference between persevering and persistence. Persevering means you overcome obstacles and see progress towards your goals. Persistence means you're just constantly bashing your head against a wall regardless. So let me show you how this applies to the Theranos story. And more importantly, how you can guard yourself from either A, working for a company like this, or B, investing in one. But first, quick trip in psychology. We're going to go back about 20, 30 years to the book that Warren Buffett endorses quite a lot, which is Influence. These are the 6 principles of persuasion. It was written by Robert Cialdini. Highly researched. A lot of papers published on this work, so it's highly valuable. And I'm going to sum up those principles in one nice mnemonic. Our class. So this is our class online, and we're going to learn about the persuasion principles. So our class, reciprocity. I give you something, then you're likely to give me something back, right? That's a form of persuasion. Consistency. As you get older, you are more likely to be committed and stay consistent with something, okay? So if you tell me one thing a year ago and say, yeah, I'll consider buying this later on, me holding you to the consistency of that will make it more persuasive. Liking. We like people who are like us, right? So because I'm a guy with a beard and black hair and Turkish heritage, if I meet another guy who's of Turkish heritage, there's a liking principle there. He is more likely to influence me. I'm more likely to influence him. We also like, the liking principle also applies when it's someone who's a lot more attractive than us in a variety of ways, whether it's looks, background, academics. That's why salespeople are usually very charismatic and good looking, and they're, those ones are the ones that do very well. Authority bias. This is how Marlboro sold lots of cigarettes back, 50 years ago. They had a doctor in a white coat. That's an authority figure. Okay. There's a famous psychology study where they had people come in and shock other people who were taking an exam, and if they got an exam question wrong, they would shock them, and they did it because somebody in a white coat was telling them to. That's an authority bias. Scarcity. When something is in very little supply, for example, when you go on Amazon and for whatever reason, a very common item, there's only 3 of them in their warehouse, that scarcity principle is more persuasive to get you to buy. And lastly, it's social proof, and this is a very powerful one, which is really built into our genes and DNA. Saying that what everybody else does, if the tribe is doing it, then I should do it too. It's safe. It's a good idea. So let's put that aside now and walk through the Theranos thing. So first, okay, 2003 to 2012. This is the dropout years. The story of Elizabeth Holmes dropping out of school, right, to pursue this endeavor, right? It's a hero story, and it's a story that we really wanted to believe in. Okay, let's go back to our persuasions. Okay, liking this young, attractive, charismatic person who was better than all of us, dropped out of Stanford, so she must be really smart. There's a liking principle there. There's also an authority principle there. This person is very smart, comes from a well-off family, drops out of Stanford. Plus, she had the backing of her Stanford professor, right? More authority principle, okay? There's a scarcity principle here as well. She's a young female. How many young female scientists do we hear about dropping out of a school like Stanford to start, a big company, right? It's a story we wanted to believe in, but we're also persuaded by. So the time goes by, they raise money. The next question that a lot of people ask is, how in the world did she get all these investors on board? Look, Kosovich, General Mattis, George Shultz, Henry Kissinger, none. The Walton family, who owns Walmart, the Davos family, Rupert Murdoch, Robert Kraft even invested in them, and Cox Media Group, which is in some way, I believe, related to or somehow owned by Carlos Slim, Mexico's richest man, right? Here's how that happens. For one, this group of investors, a lot of them either fell into the political circle, or they were all part of, or a good amount of them were part of this Stanford alumni group, right? Guess what that has to do with? That has to do with liking principle, because it's people like me, and there's a social proof. Oh, if all the heavyweight people, authority principle, are investing in this company, and they're like me, liking principle, and there's a social proof, maybe I should too, and then it just becomes a domino effect. And once this gets going from a momentum standpoint, it just keeps adding and adding more speed. Just like, if you look at Newton's laws in physics, once a mass is developing more and more mass to it, it'll be able to accelerate at a higher speed and with more force. So then we go to 2013. Another big thing happens, right? All these smart people, highly regarded, well invested, families and investors have invested. So when Walgreens comes around in 2013, then it's really hard to overcome the persuasion of this, even though Walgreens hired their own consultant, and he even said, some of this doesn't make sense. These tests, just don't add up. Why aren't they showing us how the tests work? Why aren't they showing us any of the labs? This had so much momentum behind it. Plus, there's a lot of backing from the medical community, but people who didn't actually use the machines, it was the concept of it, right? People need a story to believe in, right? Young, female, Stanford dropout, leaves school, starts to dress like Steve Jobs. See, there's a liking principle there. There's an association bias there. Has all of these heavily respected people behind it, so it must be true, right? So Walgreens fell into this bias. Now, there's so much momentum here; it keeps building through. 2014, she did a TED-Med talk, on the company, and talks about it in a very grandiose fashion. There we have, look, an authority bias, right? It's just gaining more and more speed. 2015, the Forbes cover. She made the cover of Forbes, and she was listed as the youngest self-made female billionaire in the world, right? So there's all this momentum. Had it not been for these events in 2015, Theranos would probably still exist today and somehow skating by, eluding authorities, manipulating investors and employees, right? And by the way, let's talk about the employees there, because a lot of people said, well, what about the employees who are there? Aside from the fact they're all aggressively hushed because of the general counsel at Theranos, they also fell into social proof bias. And keep in mind the mental trap of persistence, again, from this book. They kept focused and they fell into a sunk cost fallacy, which is they just kept working on it. Even though the machines didn't work and they knew it, they kept working on it, and they all kind of drank the Kool-Aid. Plus, so many people wanted to work for this company, it was easy just to change out employees, and they were getting top quality employees, designers and product managers from places like Apple, Google, and of course that makes sense because look at the cognitive biases and momentum from here, right? Plus, most importantly, internally, a lot of people say, well, what about internally? If these employees knew something was wrong, why didn't they speak out? Why were so many of them influenced, by this? And I'm going to point to another book. That book, which is a very good one, and I have a lot of respect for this man because he's very good at what he does, is Scott Adams, Win Bigly. Scott Adams pretty much predicted Trump's election and the fact that Trump would win 2 years in advance, and he wrote it all in this book. But what people don't know about Scott Adams, aside from the fact that he is the creator of Dilbert, is that he is in fact a trained hypnotist and persuasion artist. And he actually ranks the most persuasive themes from number 1 all the way to number, I think, 9 or 10. At the very bottom of that list is logic and reason, right? And if you look at all the things that happen here, it's not logic and reason that's guiding and persuading. It's one of these 3 things. Big fear, identity, and small fear. So let's talk about that for a moment. So when it comes to big fear, why is it that it's big fear? If you look at the way human beings think and the way they function, human beings very rarely take action when they are about to gain something. They are more likely, and this has been an experiment that's done multiple times, they're more likely to take action when there's something to lose, right? And more specifically, when there's a fear. If you look at how the last election happened, do you think people voted because of the idea of gaining something or because of a fear of something happening, right? So with employees at Theranos, the big fear was if you speak out against the company, and of course if you speak out against the head of our tribe, which is, this is an evolutionary standpoint, you speak out against the head of a tribe thousands of years ago, you get banished and vanished, and you're going to die, right? That brain that existed thousands of years ago still exists today. So a lot of these employees had that big fear of getting fired, and more importantly, legal action. If you speak out about us, you will be fired. And if you get fired, we will take legal action and pursue a lawsuit against you. The second thing is identity. A lot of the people who are working there, scientists, PhDs, MDs, engineers, these are people who really take pride in their work. Their work and their job is truly their identity. So part of that is that they persuaded themselves because of identity that they could stay there and try and make things right. That they just had to, keep at it. Again, that's the persistence, the sunk loss fallacy, which is not being able to abandon something, right? And that's what kept a lot of people there. Now, let's look at these investors. Big fear, right? Big fear of missing out. FOMO, fear of missing out. So once you get one of these investors, right, any of these big names, it's very easy that others are going to come on board. Have you noticed that some of the startups here in Silicon Valley, it seems that a lot of them, some just have this luck of gaining all the best investors or board members. That doesn't happen by accident. It takes one, and because of big fear as a cognitive bias and social proof, a lot more investors and money gets attracted. So let's go through. So we have all this momentum built up. Newton's laws in physics says when you have a mass in motion, the only thing that can change it is the inertia from a different force. And guess what? In 2015, 2016, something happened. The human mind always looks for patterns. And once we see a pattern, we usually turn off. So with Elizabeth Holmes, young Stanford dropout, she's successful, gaining more and more momentum, great. So at some point, people liked that story, they embraced it, they wanted to believe it, but they forgot about it for the most part. With the exception of it being in their face on the Forbes cover, they forgot about it. But in 2015, same year, or around the same time as the Forbes cover, here's what happened. First, Wall Street Journal, John Carreyrou, sorry John, I can't pronounce your name, publishes this article, which is in stark contrast to what people have in mind. It's incongruent. The mind will immediately pay attention to that because it says, hey, that's different from what we know. Why is this important? Because from a survival standpoint, anytime any kind of pattern changes, the mind immediately gets activated and causes us to focus on whatever just changed. If you take the same route to work every single day, but all of a sudden there's, let's say, a big billboard, right, off to the side, or maybe there's a little construction, your mind will immediately notice that because it's incongruent. It's different from the pattern you're used to. Okay, that came out. Then that same year, Theranos voids 2 years of tests, right? Stark contrast. There's even more focus on this other story over here. And then to top it all off, Medicare and Medicaid comes out and says that Theranos has violated a variety of their guidelines, and then they prohibited, I think, their Newark office from actually functioning, and they put them, they put them on some type of list. I can't think of the name. The point of this, though, is that this is how scams, frauds, this is how they get constructed, right? And it's less about Elizabeth Holmes. Yes, sure, she was the head of the company, but she's not exactly this big manipulative mastermind. Definitely she did some very manipulative things. At the same time, though, you just have to do a few things, and then the momentum of all those little dominoes falling will just keep on gaining speed, and forget dominoes, more like a snowball. It'll just keep gaining more and more mass, more and more acceleration, right? More investors, more big names, more articles, more PR, etc., etc. And that works here in the Valley. Works for a lot of companies, right? This idea of fake it till you make it. The problem, though, is when you have people's lives at stake, patience, right? Because when you get into a sunk loss fallacy, the worldview, the story that you've told yourself, now cannot be changed. That's a program that you're constantly running, and this is the frame of reference you have. So no matter what you're telling yourself, even though your own devices don't function and you have to purchase other competing companies' devices to run the blood tests, you've somehow validated that story somehow in your mind because you're in a sunk loss fallacy. You've fallen into a mental trap called persistence, and you're persisting. And I think I'm making a hypothesis here that in 2015, Theranos, with these stories, was probably the most united as a company. Why? Because, again, let's go back to this. Big fear, identity, small fear. When the Wall Street Journal came out with its article about Theranos, it's a scathing article, and that was really the first thing to kind of set its unraveling in motion. Elizabeth Holmes and her COO, Sunny Balwani, had a big all-hands-on meeting with the whole company in their cafeteria, and they talked about it, and they said, this reporter and the Wall Street Journal are trying to hurt us and hurt our company, and we're not going to let that happen, right? And so within that, somehow a chant started as a joke, but it actually became a real thing where they're saying, F you, Carrie Woo. And that gained momentum into them even creating like a Space Invaders game where they're actually shooting this villain, which was John Carreyrou. And I mention this because even if you're in a company where you're not happy and it's toxic, the moment that someone starts attacking it and it's pointed out, it's an attack on identity because you're an employee at that company, right? The big fear of, well, if I'm being attacked, that's threatening my livelihood, my money, the money that I need to feed myself, to take care of my family, right? And so I hypothesize, and I could be wrong about this, that had more of these things not happened this year, let's just say it was that Wall Street Journal article, I don't know if that was going to be enough to unravel Theranos right away. It might have happened over time with investigation, but had these other things not happened, right? And of course, many other factors I haven't mentioned, it wouldn't have been enough momentum to stop the inertia from all of this. So I hope that was educational for you. I hope you enjoyed it. And as always, happy Wisdom Wednesday.